Let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered if one tiny action, just one moment of standing your ground, could actually ripple out and change the world? Imagine this. You're asked to do the impossible, to hold a line against an overwhelming force. You fight, you get captured, and for the rest of your life you believe you failed, only to find out, decades later, that your failure was the very thing that saved thousands of lives and literally changed the outcome of a world war. Okay, we have to get into this because this is one of the most unbelievable small unit stories in all of military history.
Just look at that number, 28 to 1. Those were the odds. On this frozen, snow-covered ridge in Belgium, in the dead of winter in 1944, 18 American GIs looked down a hill and saw 500 enemy soldiers coming right for them. I mean, that's not just being outnumbered, that's a statistical impossibility. It's the kind of math where survival, let alone winning, isn't even on the table.
So you have to ask, right? Is that even possible? Could a small handful of guys, most of whom had never even seen real combat, actually stop an entire battalion of Germany's best, most battle-hardened paratroopers? Well, the answer is so much more complicated and, frankly, more heroic than anyone could have possibly imagined. And it all starts with their commander, who was just 20 years old.
Yeah, our story really kicks off on this quiet little ridge with this small group of unwitting Davids. They were led by First Lieutenant Lyall Book. And yeah, you heard me right, he was only 20. But he wasn't some fresh-faced kid who was new to the uniform. He'd actually joined the National Guard when he was just 14 years old during the Great Depression, to help put food on the table for his family. That hardship, that early responsibility, it forged this kind of resilience in him that was about to be tested beyond any imaginable limit.
Now this is what makes the story so wild. You have to understand what Book's unit was. They were an I&R platoon, Intelligence and Reconnaissance. Think of them as the eyes and ears of the Army. These guys were hand-picked. They were expert shots, in peak physical condition, and their job was to be ghosts. Sneak behind enemy lines, see what's going on, and then just fade back into the woods. They were never meant to be a defensive line. Their job was to run from a big fight, not start one.
And the strategic picture here is just so important. By the end of 1944, pretty much all the Allied commanders thought the German army was broken, that it was on its last legs. The Ardennes forest, where our story takes place, was considered a quiet sector. It was like a nursing home for tired divisions, and a place to let brand new green troops get a feel for things without any real danger. It was quiet, a little too quiet.
So, Book gets his orders. His tiny platoon of 18 guys is sent to this ridge near a village called Lanzerath. Their mission? To plug a 5-mile-wide gap in the American lines. So this is where Book's instincts kick in. He has his men dig in like their lives depend on it, because they did. They dug deep foxholes, camouflaged them perfectly, set up interlocking fields of fire, and then he did something really smart. He had all his men zero their rifles and machine guns on a wire fence about 100 yards down the hill. He effectively turned that whole snowy field into a pre-aimed kill zone. And then at 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, the quiet sector just exploded. 1,600 German cannons opened fire all at once. This was it, the start of Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West, what we now call the Battle of the Bulge. Book and his men just huddled in their foxholes as the forest was literally torn to shreds around them. And miraculously, because they dug in so well, they all survived, shaken, but okay.
Okay, this is the moment where things go from bad to just hopeless. As the shelling stops, Book peeks out of his foxhole and he watches, in total disbelief, as the American tank destroyers and other units behind him just start their engines and pull out. They just leave. No warning, no good luck, nothing. In an instant, his 18 men went from being a small part of a bigger line to being the only thing standing between the German army and the entire American rear. They were completely, utterly alone.
Let's just pause for a second and really look at this mismatch. On one side, you've got 18 scouts from a brand new division. On the other, about 500 elite German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger. These were some of the best, most experienced soldiers Germany had left. It wasn't just about the numbers. It was experience, mission, firepower, everything. This was the definition of a David versus Goliath fight.
So, seeing this massive German force getting ready to attack, Book does the smart thing. He gets on the radio and asks permission to pull back, to fight a delaying action. It was the textbook move. But the answer that came back over the radio was chilling. It was basically negative. Stay where you are. Reinforcements are on the way. Hold at all costs. Those were his orders. There was no escape.
So around 10 in the morning, the first wave of white camouflage German paratroopers starts walking up the hill. They're not even running, they're so confident. Book, showing incredible discipline, tells his men to hold their fire. Wait. He waits until they cross that wire fence he'd ranged earlier, and then he gives the order. The entire ridge just erupts in fire. The Germans walked right into that kill zone, and the platoon's accurate, disciplined fire was just devastating. The attack completely fell apart in minutes.
The German commander on the other side must have been stunned. He probably thought he'd run into an entire company. So he regroups, and around noon, he sends a second, bigger wave, this time with mortar and machine gun support. And again, it just breaks against this American wall of fire. Book's men, these incredible marksmen, are just picking their targets. More Germans fall. The snow in front of their foxholes started turning red.
Then, around 2 in the afternoon, the Germans try again. This is their third and most furious assault. They just throw everything they have at the ridge, desperate to crush this small pocket of resistance that's holding up their whole advance. The pressure on Book's men was just unbelievable. They were running out of ammo, guys were getting wounded, but they just kept firing.
And right in the middle of this third attack, the absolute worst thing happens. Their biggest weapon, a .50 caliber machine gun, had fired so many rounds so fast that the barrel started to glow cherry red. It got so hot it started cooking off rounds, firing all by itself without anyone pulling the trigger. Then, the barrel warped from the heat and the whole thing just jammed. It was completely useless. At the most critical moment, their most powerful weapon went silent.
By sunset, it was over. They had fought for almost 10 hours straight. They were down to their last few bullets. Almost every man was wounded. The Germans, who couldn't break them head-on, finally managed to sneak around their sides. Book's position was surrounded, and one by one, their foxholes were silenced. The battle was over. The platoon was captured, and in their own minds, they had failed. Utterly.
But this right here is where the story actually begins. Because what every single one of those captured, wounded, and defeated soldiers believed was a total failure was actually a victory so huge, so strategically important, that none of them could have possibly understood it at the time.
A few hours later, around midnight, the real spearhead of the German attack finally shows up in Lanzerath. This was Kampfgruppe Piper, an elite SS Panzer division, and its commander was a notorious officer named Joachim Piper. He was supposed to be miles down the road by now, but he arrives to find the paratroopers just sitting there. He gets out of his tank and he is furious. He screams at their commander, "Why have you stopped?" The answer he gets is that they spent the entire day fighting a huge American force on that ridge. Now this is where you can see the disaster for the German war plan. In a blitzkrieg, time is the most important weapon you have. Piper's tanks were supposed to be at the Meuse River by the end of the first day. Instead, he's stuck in a traffic jam behind an infantry unit that got completely spooked and held up all day by just 18 American scouts. By the time Piper finally gets his column moving again, it's 4:30 in the morning. The entire German offensive is 18 hours behind schedule.
And what can you buy with an 18-hour delay in the middle of a war? Well, it turns out you can buy everything. Those 18 hours were the critical window the Allies needed. It gave American generals just enough time to realize what was happening and to rush their best, most veteran divisions, like the 82nd and 101st Airborne, to key crossroads and bridges. That little stand on the ridge bought the time needed to build the defensive wall that would eventually stop the Battle of the Bulge cold.
But the men who made it possible, they knew none of this. They spent the rest of the war in brutal prisoner of war camps, carrying this heavy, heavy burden that they had failed. They thought they had let everyone down. For decades after the war, Lieutenant Book and his men lived with that belief, totally unaware of the monumental impact their fight had.
I mean, just look at this timeline. It's heartbreaking. It took years for historians to piece the story together from both sides. Then in 1966, out of the blue, Book gets his Silver Star in the mail. No ceremony, no explanation. It wasn't until 1981, after a major push and literally an act of Congress, 36 years after the battle, that these men were finally, formally recognized for what they did. 36 years.
And when that recognition finally came, it was historic. The whole platoon was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. And then the individual awards just poured in. 4 Distinguished Service Crosses, which is our nation's second highest award for valor, 5 Silver Stars, 9 Bronze Stars. It made them the most decorated American platoon for a single day's fight in all of World War II.
Today, the story of the Battle of Lanzerath Ridge isn't some forgotten footnote. It's actually a case study that's taught at West Point and other military academies. It's the textbook example of how leadership, discipline, and sheer courage from a tiny handful of soldiers can have a massive strategic impact that echoes far, far beyond their little piece of the battlefield. Their greatest failure turned out to be the blueprint for a huge victory.
And that just brings it all back home, doesn't it? Lieutenant Book and his men lived for almost 40 years believing they had failed. They had no way of knowing their desperate, hopeless stand was actually a world-changing success. It just makes you wonder, what are you doing right now? What line are you holding? What battle are you fighting in your own life that feels like you're losing? What unseen impact are you having that you might not fully understand for maybe another 36 years?